how I want to start off tonight is just with noticing something that's probably like very obvious to all of us, and that's that there's a major problem. When we kind of just like look out in the world and the world around us, there is a massive amount of division. So there's a massive amount of division in our country. There's a massive amount of division in our culture. And specifically what we're divided over is we're divided over ideas. So we're divided over ideas that have to do with politics and policy. And we're divided over ideas that have to do with social issues like racism. We're divided over issues of worldview and religion and morality and all of these kind of things. And really to say that we're divided is a massive understatement, because the level of division that we kind of like see and are witnessing is really astonishing. I don't think I'm ever going to get used to this weird phenomena that like I've just seen and you just see repeatedly, where it's like we can be looking at the exact same thing, the exact same event or whatever, and this typically happens in politics, and while all looking at the same thing, people can come to, not really just people, but groups can come to polar opposite conclusions. So looking at the same thing, one whole group or side of people comes to one conclusion, and a whole other group or side of people comes to the exact opposite conclusion based on the same thing. And so if we kind of put aside which tribe we fall into or which group we fall into, and we just reflect on this kind of objectively, there are serious problems at play. And there are major issues that's kind of driving all of this. And the type of division that we see is not healthy. And it's really leading to a lot of hostility. And there's even hostilities like within our own circles or our own camps. And when it comes to kind of like the state of the world that we're in, there are a lot of different factors that are at play. So I think there are probably psychological factors, there are spiritual factors, probably sociological factors. So there's a lot of different things that are like kind of led us to where we are today. So anyone who says, well, it's just this one thing, if we just change this one thing, that's just being overly simplistic. But looking at it, I can't help but think that a major reason and what kind of led us to these problems and where we are has to do with the fact that we're just really poor thinkers. The state of things like critical thinking and logic and argumentation in our culture and in the world around us is just in a really bad place. And that's something that I don't think should take any of us by surprise, because these things really aren't taught on. So when we think of like what's foundational to thinking, things like critical thinking, things like logic, things like argumentation, these concepts are rarely ever taught. Meaning, unless you're on kind of some like specified educational path, like you're pursuing becoming a philosopher or you're pursuing becoming a lawyer, you probably will never actually have like formal education in those specific fields. So you're probably not going to learn these types of things and these types of concepts from your educational institution. You're probably not going to learn them from your church. And so really the only ways that you can get this knowledge, get this skills for the most part, is if you seek it out yourself. You seek out this type of education yourself, and most people just don't do that. And this is problematic. The world, I mean, we can all agree with this. The world is confusing as it is, meaning it's really hard to know what's true because there's just so much information out there. There's so much conflicting information out there. There's so many conflicting opinions out there. And so it really does take a skill to be able to navigate kind of the world of ideas. And this is, if we're being honest, just a skill that most of us don't have. So most of us are unprepared for this. And I think that at least in part, this kind of is leading to some of the problems that we're seeing. And personally speaking, my biggest worry about all this is that I don't think the church is necessarily in a much better place. So when it comes to kind of the state of thinking that we're in, I don't, and the kind of the poor thinking that we see out in the world, I think when we compare that to the thinking and the type of thinking and the type of ideas that we see in the church, it doesn't seem like there's much of a difference. It doesn't seem like the church is much better off. And this is problematic because the church is supposed to be a beacon of light. We're supposed to be a beacon of truth. We're supposed to be a beacon of reason, yet it's kind of really hard to see that at play. And so just me personally, I am much more fearful. I'm much more afraid of the church's lack of ability to think well. I'm much more fearful of the ideas that that's leading to and the kind of ideas because of that we're allowing to creep into the church. I'm much more afraid of those things than I am who's president or who controls Congress. And so kind of the aim tonight is just to look at some important principles, some foundational principles of thinking that can help lead us to think better. And so really what we're doing tonight, we're effectively thinking about thinking, which is really important because there is a proper way to think. And that's what we're trying to get at least closer to. Before I go into kind of the principles of thinking that we're going to be discussing tonight, I want to preface what we're going to be discussing tonight with two things. So first has to do kind of with the topics and the examples that I'm going to be using. When thinking about like critical thinking, logic, argumentation, all kind of the stuff that we're going to be covering, these are well-developed fields, meaning throughout pretty much all of human history, people have been thinking about these things, well. So there's a lot of like knowledge and wisdom in these areas. And when teaching a class or a one-off thing on critical thinking or the like, there's really almost countless possibilities on how we could have gone about tonight. The different things that we could have been talking about, the different principles we could have been talking about. But the reason why I chose kind of the four things specifically that I chose is really because of my own reflection out on the kind of the world around us and just even how I think. It's really, in my opinion, kind of these are four things that are really lacking in like our current real life debates that are going on out there in the world. So meaning I think that these principles are our inability to kind of think through and apply these principles are really hindering or impacting like very current and relevant debates. Debates over things like religion and worldview, debates over things, important issues like racism, debates over things like politics and policy and all these kind of things. Like I think the reason why I chose like what we're doing is because I think that these things actually have an impact on the ideas that we really care about. And so I'm going to use examples throughout the class to kind of illustrate these principles, but I'm going to use those examples from these things. Meaning I'm going to use examples from politics or racism or other social issues or, Christianity and worldview. But the point I'm trying to get at is I'm not actually arguing for specific conclusions in those areas. So just for an example, if for instance, I use like election fraud as an example, I'm not actually trying to make any kind of conclusion or persuade you one way or another about whether election fraud happened or not. Like that's not my point tonight. I'm using examples like that simply to highlight and think about like the underlying thinking that goes into how we're arriving at certain conclusions about those things. Does that make sense? So I'm really focused on the underlying issues behind that and where we might be going wrong, whether we're right about those subject matters or not. Just the point is, don't get like caught up in those subject matters. So if I mention something like that, don't be like, whoa, what is he trying to say? What is he trying to conclude? Is he disagreeing with me? That's not the point. The second thing I want to preface this with, and this is more important, the focus about what we're talking about tonight, the focus is you, like you individually. And so for me, it's about me individually. What I'm trying to get at is, don't make the things that we talk about tonight about other people. So this is going to be kind of like in a sense, a very highly critical class, meaning I'm really trying to highlight and improve on bad thinking. And one reason this can be highly critical is just because I'm highly critical about myself and like my own thinking. And by far the worst approach that you could possibly take to like the class and the content tonight is like if I say something about a poor way of thinking, it's like, yeah, I know of someone else who thinks like that. Or, yeah, the other political party that I don't subscribe to, they do that kind of thing all the time. No, that's not the point. The point is you do that all the time. I do that all the time. This is meant to be like highly reflective. We do these kind of things. And no doubt, like there are a lot of people kind of out there in the world who's trying to deceive you, who's trying to persuade you about like false things. and we want to guard against that. But I think the principle that we don't often understand is that the number one person who's going to try to mislead you is you. And I hope that kind of what we talk about helps you convince you of that principle. So just the main point is just don't, at least right now, worry about other people. What we talk about for sure will help you spot flaws in other people's arguments, but we really can't fix anyone else's thinking until we fix our own. And so let's get into the 4, what I think are highly applicative principles of just clear or proper thinking. And the first is this: sound thinking is about the process. The end goal of thinking in general, really rational thinking, is truth. So we're trying to arrive at truth. So for example, if someone says God exists and someone else says, no, he doesn't exist. If someone says, America is deeply racist and someone else says, well, no, America isn't. Or someone says the 2020 election was stolen and someone else says, no, it wasn't. The goal of us thinking, what rational thinkers are trying to get at is we're trying to arrive at the truth of the matter. So in those instances, we're trying to arrive at what is true. We want our beliefs about those things and anything else to align with reality. A rational person, they want to believe what is actually the case. Now, good and kind of like critical thinking is all about the process that helps get us there. So we're really trying to focus on how are we arriving at the things we believe. And when it comes to this process, what we want a good, reliable, and repeatable process. And I'm emphasizing process for a reason. Because typically when people think about thinking, what the focus is it's just all focused on the end goal. So my belief is either true or false. The way I'm thinking is either right or wrong. And no doubt that that's good in the sense that that is the end goal. But when we only think on like the end result, it's the process that gets us there that often gets neglected, and this leads to mistakes. So I hope this makes sense. Even though the end goal of good thinking is truth, just because you have truth or just because you're right about something doesn't mean that you actually thought well to get you there. So just because you're right about something, so maybe like new information just came out that confirms, hey, I've been right about this belief all along. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that you were using good thinking to get you there. So sometimes you can actually come to right or true conclusions and still have like poor underlying thinking. And this is why sometimes truth can actually obscure bad thinking. Let me just give you one example to hopefully help this make sense. Let's say that you're a Christian. So you have Christian beliefs, right? You believe that God exists. You believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that he resurrected and all this. That's a very good thing, right? And that's a good thing because those beliefs are actually true. But let's say your only justification for why you believe those things, so not how you came to that, but like if I ask you right now, why do you believe those things, is because you were raised that way. So effectively, the only reason why you believe those things, why do you believe this? Well, I basically inherited those views from my parents. Now, is it a good thing that you believe those things? For sure. Is it a good thing that your parents raised you that way? Yes, definitely. But that's not an actual rational or reliable process of coming to beliefs. Effectively, in that situation, you kind of just got lucky. You're very lucky that your parents raised you as a Christian. But that in and of itself isn't a reliable process of coming to beliefs, meaning you wouldn't want to like stick with that process going forward. You only believe things because that's what your parents told you to believe, right? You want a more reliable process than that. And another way to think about that is that we wouldn't really, in our minds, we wouldn't allow that justification for other people. So if we're having a conversation with an atheist, for example, and we're trying to debate on whether God exists, and they say, well, I'm an atheist and my justification for it is because my parents raised me that way. We wouldn't say, okay, well, that's good, then your thinking is right, and just stop there. It's like, no, we want to show you a better way to think about this, right? We want to help you see the evidence that you're wrong. That's not sufficient, so we would still want to change their thinking. But the same thing applies to us. We can have true beliefs on things, yet still come to them through some sort of like unreliable process. And that's what we're really trying to get at with critical thinking, get to that underlying process. And really the takeaway is this: even if you're convinced, which most people are, that you have all the right views, so even if you're convinced that you have all the right beliefs about religion and worldview, all the right beliefs about politics and social issues, even if you're truly convinced that you have all the right beliefs, it's still worth examining the process that led you to those beliefs. Because ultimately what we want is we want a reliable, repeatable system of thinking that's really going to help us arrive at true beliefs going forward, help us navigate difficult issues going forward. So the first principle, just when it comes to sound thinking, when it comes to clear thinking, it's all about that process. And just because you believe true things about in certain areas doesn't necessarily mean that you have a good process or that you think well. The second principle, seek proper conclusions. I'm going to introduce you to a concept called the standard form of an argument. And the standard form when it comes to an argument this is really just like a setting out an argument in a formal and explicit way. So setting out some sort of argument where it starts off with certain premises on top that lead to some sort of conclusion at the bottom. And so let's just look at a really common argument against the existence of God. This is called the problem of evil. This would be the problem of evil laid out in standard form. So the premises would be premise number 1, if evil exists, there is no God. Premise number 2, evil exists, and then the conclusion, therefore there is no God. And so when we write out arguments in standard form, it's really just kind of like fleshing out an argument, making your claims and conclusion explicit. And one reason why this is so good is just because it's very clear. So in this argument, for example, you know exactly what the person is concluding, and you know exactly how they are supporting that conclusion. Now, of course, in everyday conversation, like we don't talk this way, right? So if we're just having a conversation, if you're just having a conversation with an atheist, they're not going to say it like this. They're probably just going to say like, of course God doesn't exist. Look at the evil out there. And so this is kind of just like that type of reasoning, the kind of informal type of reasoning just fleshed out. And it's really good to be able to think like this and to be able to almost like translate what everyday arguments people are making into this type of form where you're like, okay, well, what specifically are they concluding? What are the premises? How are they basically supporting that? Because the better we get at that process, the more we think like that, the better we'll be able to like evaluate and break down arguments. Because this is a lot easier to break down and evaluate than just kind of how we typically speak of this, because it's all just laid out there right for us. We know exactly what someone's arguing, so we know exactly what to attack effectively. Now, when it comes to arguments, there's a very important principle called validity. And validity just has to do with whether or not a conclusion follows from the premises. So if an argument is valid, all that means is that the conclusion being made follows logically from the statements before it. So does the conclusion follow from the statements before it? And so just for actually one point of confusion here when it comes to like seeing whether an argument is valid or not, where people get often confused is that being valid, at this point, we're not looking to see if the argument is true or not. We're actually not even looking to know if the premises are true or not. Validity just has to do with form, like the form of the argument. Do the premises lead to that conclusion? So just for an example, in this argument, for the problem of evil, this argument right here is actually a valid argument. And now if you're thinking, wait, how could that possibly be a valid argument? Do you not think that God exists? No, of course I don't think that. I think that God does exist. But right now we're not worried about truth. We're just worried about the form of the argument. Do the premises lead to that conclusion? And in this case, yeah, they do. So if it's true that evil exists, there is no God, evil exists, the logical conclusion of that is therefore there is no God. So when we're thinking about validity, all we're thinking about, does this first statement, whether it's true or not, combined with this second statement, whether it's true or not, lead to that conclusion. And in this case, it does. And by the way, arguments can have one premise, they can have more than two premises, so they don't all take this exact form. But so that's validity. We're just asking, does the conclusion follow? And so in this case, it logically does. But let's alter the argument a little bit. Now the argument is, if evil exists, there is no God. Stars exist. Conclusion, therefore, there is no God. This argument is clearly invalid, right? And you kind of like chuckle a little bit on seeing it, because your natural question is like, what do stars have to do with anything, right? And the question is the right one, because they don't have anything to do with anything when it comes to this argument. Like stars have nothing to do with it. That's the exact point. So these premises, the first and second, they don't actually connect. They're radically disconnected. Stars just kind of come out of nowhere. And because they're disconnected, nothing actually logically follows from it. So that conclusion certainly doesn't follow from that. And so that's an invalid argument. Nothing follows from it. The reason why I bring up these kind of like ideas about validity and arguments and how the arguments are formed is because this is actually a really important principle. And validity is kind of, when you're evaluating arguments, it should be kind of like naturally and instinctually the first thing that you think about. Is this argument that someone's giving, is this argument that I'm giving valid? And what happens is in arguments, what often happens is we end up wasting so much time like evaluating the specific content of arguments where nothing actually follows from them in the first place. So this is something that I want you to see. Let's just look at that second argument right there. Obviously, this is a silly example, and it's not usually that obvious to see that an argument someone is making is invalid, but let's just use this to kind of flesh some things out. In order to see that this is a bad argument, you don't actually have to know anything about the subject matter. You don't need to know anything about God's relationship to evil. You may have never thought about that. You don't even have to argue that kind of thing. Why? We don't even have to get into that, because before we even get there, there's a fatal flaw in the argument with its form. Nothing actually follows from that. It fails on other grounds. And so I want you to kind of get into this type of thinking. At first, maybe it's conscious, but eventually it'll become subconscious, where you're just naturally thinking, are the arguments that people are making, are the arguments that I'm making actually valid? Because way more often than you think, they aren't. Way more often than you think, the conclusions that we're making don't actually follow from the arguments and the premises and the statements that we're giving. And it actually happens more often than you think from people who should actually know better. Let me give you an example of this. Not too long ago, maybe a year or so ago, Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous atheist in the world, he was interviewed by Joe Rogan, who's like probably the most famous podcaster in the world. And so this interview was about God's existence. It was kind of about an upcoming book that Richard Dawkins was writing, and the book had to do with like kind of arguing against God's existence. And since it was on Joe Rogan's podcast, a ton of people saw it, a ton of Christians saw it, and I know a lot of Christians were shaken from it. Their faith was stirred up. I know personally multiple people whose faith was like shaken up by that discussion. I did a little bit of a video breakdown a while ago, so it's somewhere on the Branch website, kind of breaking down at least a part of that conversation. It's a long interview, so you can't break down it all. And one thing that I was trying to show is that the arguments that Richard Dawkins was giving shouldn't shake any Christian simply because they're really, really bad arguments. And one thing in particular that I was trying to show is that a lot of times what he was concluding, and what he was concluding is that God doesn't exist, didn't actually follow from the support he was giving for that claim. And now this is funny because it's like Richard Dawkins, you would think that he would know better. But we don't always, because we don't always think in these types of terms. So I want you to get to think in these terms. So let me just give you one example from that interview. So there's one point, and it's actually really brief, but where Joe Rogan is saying to Richard Dawkins, he's like, Richard Dawkins, I love this one particular argument you give. It's just a home run. It's awesome. You hit it out of the park. And he's talking about the argument that Richard Dawkins gives where all of us are effectively atheists. The problem is in that specific interview, they don't really flesh it out much more than that. They kind of just move on from the conversation. But just because I know what he's referring to, let's flesh it out a little bit more. So the argument that Richard Dawkins makes is that effectively we're all atheists. So atheists meaning we don't believe in God's existence, as opposed to a theist, someone who believes that God exists. And you might be thinking, well, how could we be atheists? Like, I believe in God. I believe in the Christian God. Well, how he explains it is we're all effectively atheists because when it comes to the vast majority of gods, 99% of them out there, we don't believe in them. So you don't believe in Zeus. You don't believe in Thor. You don't believe in the Islamic God. You don't believe in like the God of Mormonism or whatever. And so he's saying we're atheists with respect to all of those other gods out there. Now, there are massive like issues with that statement, but I want to kind of more focus on the things that we're talking about. So let's start by just looking at the conclusion, because the natural question when Joe Rogan is saying, hey, that argument, you hit it out of the park. My natural question, I think a logical question, is argument for what? Like when you make that argument, Richard Dawkins or whoever, like what are you specifically arguing for? And the logical answer is they're arguing for atheism. He's arguing that because of this, God doesn't exist. I mean, that's what their whole like interview was basically about. And what else are you going to bring Richard Dawkins on your show for? So I don't know what else they could be concluding. And at the very least, people take it that way. So let's just lay that out. That's basically the conclusion right there from this argument, is that God doesn't exist. Well, how is he defending that? How is he supporting that conclusion? Well, effectively, he's supporting that conclusion by saying, hey, you're all effectively atheists. So if effectively the main premise is you don't believe in other gods. You don't believe in Zeus, you don't believe in Thor and all these things. That's the main support. That's the main premise to land at the conclusion, therefore God exists. So now one reason why I wanted to kind of show you like how we can lay out arguments is because this helps make all these things much clearer. So this, I'm not just like picking on low-hanging fruit here, like, oh, I'm just picking the worst arguments out there because that makes us sound a lot smarter. No, Joe Rogan himself said, Dawkins, you hit this argument out of the park. A lot of Christians have been like shaken from this argument. I've heard it. A lot of atheists I've heard say, hey, I really like this argument. When you actually lay it out, I hope it kind of takes the sting out of it, because I don't exactly know, and this is why I actually wish the conversation would have went on, like how either Joe Rogan or Richard Dawkins is kind of like going to fill that out, the other premises. But what I do know right off the bat when I look at it like this is there's no way they're going to be able to make this a valid argument. There's no way that you can make a conclusion God does not exist based on the premise you don't believe in other gods or you're all effectively atheists. Think of it this way. How could any conclusion about God's existence be mainly based on a premise about me? How could any conclusion like for God's existence be based on a premise about you or our psychology about what we believe? It just can't. That has nothing to do with that. Seemingly, or like if God exists or doesn't exist, that like that truth pre-existed us, so he existed before we did. So how can I start with you believe in other gods, therefore God doesn't? You'll never get there. This isn't a valid argument. It's not a good argument at all. The problem is we don't think in these types of terms. And so we immediately hear this and we start to argue specific points, which we just don't have to. There's plenty to argue here. But notice that to see that this isn't a good argument, you don't actually have to know anything about other gods. You don't have to know anything about why we believe in other gods or why we don't. It's irrelevant. You can just look at this right in itself and say, this argument fails just on the mere fact that it's clearly invalid. You can't make your conclusions in the way that you are. And so I just want us to kind of get into these ways of thinking. So I have two questions. When someone is making an argument, or even when we're forwarding an argument, there's kind of two questions that I want us to kind of just naturally think of. And the more we do this, the more it'll just become habit. So the first is, when someone's forwarding some sort of argument, the first question is, what specifically is being concluded? So many times when people are attempting to make arguments, what's being concluded or what they're leading or getting at isn't really clear. And so I think the Joe Rogan example is perfect. When he says, hey, that's a great argument, Richard Dawkins, my first question is going to be, argument for what? Like, what specifically are you concluding off of that? Because if you're concluding off that, what I think you're concluding off that, that doesn't actually follow. And so that actually leads us to the second question. After we figure out what we're trying to conclude or what someone else is trying to conclude, the second question to kind of just logically ask is, does that conclusion follow? Does whatever conclusion that someone's attempting to be made follow from the support that they're giving for it? And more often than not, it doesn't. But just the point here is just let's think in these kind of terms, in terms of like validity. Is an argument valid? Does it actually follow? And the more that we can do this, the more that we do this, the more we'll actually be able to like just naturally break down these kind of things subconsciously. So that's principle number 2, just seek proper conclusions. Principle number 3, when it comes to good thinking, beware of confirmation bias. When it comes to arguments, you definitely want more than just validity, meaning you want your arguments to have more than just a good form. You actually want the premises to be true. And in order to know that they're true, you need evidence. Okay, so when you forward an argument, you don't just want it to have a good form, you actually want it to have evidence to support the kind of things that you're claiming that lead to your conclusion. Now, when it comes to evidence, there's some really important ideas that need to be fleshed out. When considering evidence, what we're seeking after is the balance of evidence. Meaning when we're seeking evidence for some sort of conclusion or some sort of proposition, what we're looking for is we're looking for the evidence for and against that claim or that proposition. So we want to see where does the evidence actually balance out when we look at evidence for it and when we look at evidence against it. So just for example, when it comes to God's existence, the reason why I very strongly believe in God's existence isn't because there's just so much evidence in favor of God's existence. Don't get me wrong, there is, and that's a huge aspect of it, but it's not the only aspect of it. The reason why I believe in God's existence is because the balance of evidence for that conclusion is overwhelming. And the balance of evidence includes more than just evidence for it. So for example, the arguments that are made against my arguments are poor. The arguments for atheism, so that concluding that God doesn't exist, are almost non-existent. And so all of those things need to be considered when we're really looking honestly at making conclusions about certain things. So why do I bring this up? The reason why I bring this up specifically is because nowadays people talking about evidence has become almost meaningless because of the presence of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is really the near universal human tendency. So it's a tendency that we all typically have where we only use new information to confirm like our existing beliefs. So we either only use or we only seek out evidence that confirms like what we already believe or what we want to believe true. This is, of course, as opposed to what we should be doing, where we should be really evaluating whether that belief or conclusion is true or not. But that requires evidence not just for something, but also against it. And so when people say, and people say this all the time for whatever conclusion they're trying to make or get you to believe, there's so much evidence for this thing. You need to believe this. There's so much evidence for this. Too often, like what that actually means, so what you can actually translate that to is I only searched for evidence that confirmed this thing that I wanted to be true, so of course I found it. And this like issue of confirmation bias and doing this is probably more of an issue today than it's ever been. And this has to do with the fact that we're so insulated. So what social media especially has helped us do is really be like insulated from ideas that we don't like. So on social media, I only follow people who believe just like me, and I unfollow anyone who thinks any differently than me, because that's a lot more comfortable. And so what that does is since everyone I follow kind of thinks like me, I'm only getting information that confirms what I also already believe, and I'm only getting information about things that I want to believe and want to be true. And we kind of, it's not just social media, we kind of do this in real life too. You know, you stop liking people who think differently than you, so you push them out of your life. And so all the information you're getting just confirms whatever you priorly believed before. And in today's world where there's just this massive amount of information, you can find evidence for anything that you want to. Like you can, if all you're paying attention to is what you like want to hear, you can justify almost any belief for yourself. Like you can justify believing almost anything. And so like, you know how much like evidence people provide, or like if I wanted to right now, I could provide you that the earth is flat. You know how much evidence I could provide you right now that 9/11 was an inside job? I could provide you a ton of evidence on those things, but the problem is those things aren't actually true. And the problem is like you don't actually come to believing in those things based on like a good process of thinking, because most of the times when you come to those conclusions, you're not actually seeking after truth, you're seeking to confirm what you want to believe is true. And this is confirmation bias. And it's just something that we really need to be aware of because we're all prone to it. Now, this doesn't mean it's always in play, but we're always prone to it, and so it's just something that we should be aware of. Now, confirmation bias can kind of take place in two different ways. So let's think about this as like a balance of evidence. So let's say we're trying to get to some conclusion. I'll actually give you specific conclusions in a second. As like more information is presented to affirm that conclusion, you kind of move along this way. And as information is presented like against that conclusion, you move this way. And so if the balance of evidence at the end, you're kind of like right here, it just means that the evidence is like balanced out. So there's equal evidence for and against something. Now, let's think of two conclusions or propositions. And we'll make these election fraud in 2016, election fraud in 2020. So this is the conclusion that election fraud took place in 2016 with the help of the Russians. Effectively, the election was stolen from Hillary Clinton. This is the conclusion that election fraud took place in 2020, and so effectively the Democrats stole the election from Trump. Now, one way that confirmation bias can take place is effectively how we've already been talking about it, where what you're doing is you're really only seeking out evidence that goes in one direction, the direction you kind of want it to go, and then you really just easily dismiss or just ignore evidence going the other way. So maybe you deeply want this to be true, and so you look for evidence going this way and you just ignore it all this way, or the the opposite. You just look for evidence going this way, you ignore it this way. Likewise with this. You look for it one way, ignore it the other, or the total opposite. And typically the type of people who would do it one way up here would do it the other way up there. But that's not the point. We kind of get that, where it's like there's certain conclusions that you want to be true, and so you just seek evidence in that. That's backwards. You seek out evidence just going one way, and you're just willing to completely ignore or dismiss evidence going the other way. This happens all the time. This is naturally what we think of when we think of confirmation bias. There's another way that confirmation bias occurs. And this has to do with inconsistent standards of proof. So when I talk about standards of proof, what I mean is just kind of like the level of proof, the level of evidence that you need to be convinced of something. So when we talk about any of these propositions, it doesn't really matter. Don't get caught up in the details, remember? But let's say we're talking about this conclusion. How much evidence do you actually need to be convinced of this? Do you just need, if it's just slightly in favor, I'm going to believe it. Or it's like, no, I'm not going to believe it until I have near certainty, or something like that. Or maybe it's like, hey, I'm going to believe this if there's any evidence in favor of it. So it's kind of like this, the level of proof that you need to believe something. When it comes to, okay, well, what is the proper level of proof that a rational person needs to be convinced of something? That's actually a very, very difficult question to answer. That's an epistemological question. And it's very difficult to answer because, if we're being honest, thinking doesn't really work like this, where it's like, here's some proposition and I'm 60% sure it's true. We can't make those calculations. So it's difficult to know exactly where a rational person, what it would take to be convinced. What's not difficult, what we can all do, is we can all be principled about this. We can all have consistent standards of proof, whether we want something to be true or whether we don't. And this is what just doesn't always happen. Often, and we're prone to this too, so don't other people. Often what happens is we shift our standards of proof based on what we want to be true or not. Meaning, let's say I want this proposition to be true. So like any evidence in favor of it, I'm going to believe it. But then this one I definitely don't want to be true. And so unless you have certainty, if there's any even possibility that it's wrong, I'm not going to believe it. Or vice versa. So either way, like that's often kind of how we think. If there's even just the slightest amount of evidence, I'm going to believe this thing that I want to believe true. But when it's something that I don't want to believe true, the level of evidence is like certainty. You'll never actually reach that because I just don't like that idea. And what I want you to see is that that's just not a principled way of thinking. And I kind of come back to this idea of like principled way of thinking a lot because I'm kind of more and more being convinced like that matters almost more than anything. Like we want to be principled because we want to arrive at truth. We don't want to just confirm like what we want to be true. And so the kind of like the takeaway when it comes to confirmation bias, it's actually something that we all kind of just need to reflect on for ourselves. And this is a really tough question because it's a lot harder to answer honestly than we think. But it's like, what is your goal? Do you really like care about truth, or do you kind of just give lip service to it? Because I think the process that we take about thinking leads me to believe, me included, that a lot of us just want to give lip service to it. And really, we just want to believe the things that we want to believe. And if we actually do care about truth, then we have to at least be open to the counter evidence that goes against certain things that we believe. And this, like most people just really aren't open. A lot of the time we simply like dismiss or we pretend that evidence doesn't even exist without any consideration. And often that happens subconsciously. But just be careful what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you have to believe the counter evidence. I'm just saying we have to be open to it. And we have to be consistent with the way that we think about things. So if this is my standard of proof right here, it should be right there for that. And if you actually pay attention to things like this, you realize that going both ways, people aren't that consistent. And this is something that we kind of like just really have to work to be aware of, and that's why I laid it out, the different ways that confirmation bias plays out. You have to work to be aware of it. For one, because actually what's surprising but true, so many of the factors of the world that we live in, like our culture and what they're pushing us towards, actually kind of pushes us towards or promotes this type of inconsistent thinking. The fact that we're like so tribal nowadays, it's not about truth, it's about like defending your party or whatever, or whoever your group is. Like the minute you start to, why are you even questioning this? Like why are you even asking questions? Why are you even open to that? It's like, you're supposed to defend our team. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm not here to defend any team. I'm here to try to arrive at true things about important subject matters. And so you do have to kind of work on it. So that's principle 3, just beware of confirmation bias and the role it may play in your thinking. The last principle has to do with clarity. And so I'm gonna start this principle with a question. Don't answer this question out loud. 2 questions. Do you believe in evolution? Second question. Do you believe in climate change? Now, if you ask me those questions, my response is going to be, I can't answer either of those questions. Now, you'd be maybe wondering, like, why can't you answer either of those questions? Those seem like very common, simple questions. Well, you might be thinking, is it because you've never thought about them? Like, no, I think I've thought about these a lot, probably more than most typical people. Well, is it because they're just so complex of questions that you just can't arrive at any conclusion? It's like, no, I don't think that they're particularly simple questions, but they're also not particularly complicated. I think they're answers that you can arrive at. The reason I can't answer these questions is because I actually don't know what these questions mean. These questions are overly vague. So just like look at, do you believe in evolution? Evolution can mean a lot of different things. So when someone asks me that question, do you believe in evolution, they can be referring to a number of different things. They can just be referring to the idea that species change. That's uncontroversial. But they could also be referring to the idea that species have common ancestors, which that can be broken down further. They could be referring to the mechanisms of evolution, natural selection acting on random mutation. They could be referring to a specific evolutionary tree of life, where it's someone's basically path of how we got from a single cell to the diversity of life we see. And almost no two people agree on any tree of life. Let's take climate change, for example. What could it mean when someone says, do you believe in climate change? Well, climate change can refer to a lot of different things too. It could be referred to just the idea that the climate is changing. That's obvious. It could be referring to the idea that mankind has some sort of role in this change, or that mankind is primarily responsible for this change. Even those two things are different. It could be referring to the idea of the alleged kind of catastrophic impacts and consequences of this change. Or it could be a political comment, like it could have to do with policy decisions that have to do with maybe like banning or limiting fossil fuels. And so just the point I'm trying to make is even these questions, which seem so common, so obvious, they're actually not. And I want to actually know what I'm specifically agreeing to. And so things like that, I just can't give a yes or no answer without some sort of clarification. And so this brings us to our last principle, which is avoid vagueness. We want to be clear. Now, this sounds very, very basic, but this type of thing happens all the time. I think those are like two really good examples of it. And when we're actually not clear about what we're talking about, when we're actually vague, it's really problematic. And so often what happens in conversations about this or other things, what happens is that we kind of use the same words, we talk about these things, and we think that we know what the other person is talking about, but the reality is that we don't. And so what we end up doing is we end up talking past each other. You definitely don't make progress on thinking through issues this way, and often the reality is you look really dumb in the process. But what vagueness does is it leads to a fallacy of equivocation. So what a fallacy is a fallacy is just some sort of breakdown in reasoning, a breakdown in logic. And equivocation has to do with the fact that in English there are a number of words that can carry more than one meaning. So a very simple example of this is think of the word fan. So fan could mean like that thing that blows air at you to keep you cool. But fan can also mean like being a fan of something, liking something. I am a fan of the San Diego Padres. So that same word carries two different meanings. And equivocation is just this fallacy where we use certain words that can carry multiple meanings in very like ambiguous or sort of slippery ways as key points in arguments. So let me give you like a very basic kind of silly example of this. Take this argument. Stars are massive. Premise 2, Tom Cruise is a star. The conclusion, therefore, Tom Cruise is massive. Now, initially when we just look at this and just don't really dig into the content, this seems like a valid argument. If it's true that stars are massive, all stars are massive, and Tom Cruise is a star, what logically follows is that Tom Cruise must be massive. But the reason and the problem with this and why it looks valid but it's actually not is because we're clearly equivocating on the word star. So in the first premise, star means like fiery ball up in the sky or something like that. And in the second premise, star means celebrity. So although it's the same word, and so it looks like we're talking about the same things in premise 1 and 2, we're not, because it's completely different content. And so what it results in, because those are the same words but actually different content, what we can clearly see is that premise 1 and premise 2 are completely disconnected from one another, and so nothing actually follows from them. Certainly that conclusion doesn't follow from them. Now, this is a very trivial example, but let me give you another example which carries more like meaning and weight. Let's look at this argument. A woman has a legal right to an abortion. Therefore, it is perfectly right for Susan to abort her unborn child. This is another argument that looks very valid at first. It looks like that conclusion should follow from the premise that's supporting it. And people use this type of justification like very commonly. The problem here, and the reason why this isn't valid, is because now we're equivocating on the word right. So in the middle of this argument, this key word, right, is being kind of shifted right in the middle of the argument. So at first what it means is it means a legal right. And then what it means is it means something being morally right. And it happens in the middle of the argument, so it's kind of this shift. What I want you to see is it's almost this kind of like sleight of hand. And this kind of thing takes place in arguments all the time. And we're equivocating on the word right, and those two ways of using the word right, they may seem like the same word, but they have massively different content. They're very different concepts. So a legal right is very different from a moral right. Just one example is at one time it was legally right. You had the legal right to own another person as a slave. It was never morally right. And so what's happening, and when we equivocate, it's kind of shifting this key word, this key meaning in the middle of an argument because certain words are ambiguous, certain words are vague. And there's obviously huge dangers in this, right? There's huge dangers if you're convinced by that second argument. And so the dangers of equivocation, the dangers of being vague, what it should motivate us to do is to like be very careful on how we're arguing and that we define our terms, that we should be like very clear about what like specifically we're concluding and make these things as clear as possible. And this is actually one of the major tenets of just good philosophy. You kind of want to be like ruthlessly clear. And a lack of clarity is really muddying up some really important and really consequential debates that we're having out there in the world. So concepts like racism, equality, love, justice, very, very vital and important concepts and discussions that we should definitely be having. These concepts are very ill-defined in today's conversation. And all the time in these conversations about these things, those words and the meanings that we're actually connecting to them, they shift from conversation to conversation. In fact, the meaning shifts like within the its own conversation often. And what this does when we kind of use those words ambiguously or vaguely, it leads to very poor conversations and actually really leads to really poor conclusions about very important subject matter. If we really care about these issues, what we should be doing is we should be being like very clear and helping people to understand what we're saying and what specifically we're concluding. And there's so much more that needs to be said about this fourth principle of like seeking clarity and avoiding vagueness. But just what I want to draw your attention to, even though we haven't obviously covered it sufficiently, I actually think that this is probably the most important principle that I believe we've been talking about tonight. This kind of way of thinking, especially when we can actually flesh it out more, in my mind is really the key to making very complicated issues like racism and that sort of thing, very complicated issues manageable. So I'm not saying it makes like very complicated issues simple or easy, but manageable. Meaning, like, I think the key to really thinking well through those types of things, and they really matter, so we should think well through them, is just being able to make distinctions. Being able to be very clear on kind of like what our terms mean, what our conclusions are, what our objectives are. So I think the key in what this is really getting at is just being able to be a nuanced thinker, which is very rare, is I think the key to like how we can actually navigate those issues where you kind of just left like, I don't know what to do with this. This is so hard. I think the key is somewhere in here, even though more needs to be fleshed out. So let me just bring up, these are the 4 principles that we talked about tonight about kind of like clear thinking. And I firmly believe that if we like really commit ourselves to understanding these things, but not just understanding these things, but really like commit ourselves to internalizing these things and actually like applying them, we will become much better thinkers. We will come to much better conclusions on issues that like really matter and things that you really care about and that really Christians should be driving the discussion about. And I think that we will be much better able to navigate the world of ideas, which is very, very difficult. There's more that needs to be said about all of these things. There's more principles that we need to bring up. I just want to end with this. When it comes to like being a sound thinker, being a clear thinker, there is a cost associated with it. When we kind of talk about, hey, I think that a lot of us, more than we think, or in the world is really filled with people who are poor thinkers. My contention is that I actually don't think that many people, even if we are poor thinkers, even necessarily like attempt to pursue like good thinking or even necessarily want to pursue good thinking because of this cost associated with it. What do I mean? Well, for one, I think there's kind of like an internal cost to being a real rational, sound thinker. And the internal cost is kind of like this internal strife. When we think of like the beliefs that we hold to, a lot of the beliefs we really tie to our identity. And a lot of the beliefs we hold to, we kind of connect it to our ego. And so when a belief or something that I hold to be true is challenged, I kind of feel that like that's a personal attack. And so we kind of have this sense where we really try to protect, and I think this comes out in things like confirmation bias, where we try to really protect the things that we actually believe rather than actually seeking truth. And so what this does is it means that rational thinking and me building my abilities to think rationally is almost a threat, because there's not a single one of us in here who has all right beliefs. And so the better we think, the more the things that we believe are at some level going to be challenged. But this is painful because the things that we believe are very comfortable and we don't want these things challenged. And so like just even pursuing this is not an easy task, and it does raise these kind of like internal strife within us. We don't want to challenge the things that we believe, and so like we don't want to be the people challenging those things even in ourselves. I think there's also an external cost to being like a good especially principled, but reasonable thinker. And this has to do with like, I think it sometimes creates external division. And it's sort of based on that same principle that people naturally hold to their belief system in a way where they just are comfortable with their beliefs. Like, I want these things to be true. I tie these things to my identity. And so what most people don't want, especially as we grow more and more tribal, even though they might say that they want this, what people don't really want, you can kind of see just by how human beings behave in real life and on social media. No one actually, even though we'll say differently, most people don't really want to be surrounded by like good principled thinkers who are going to challenge the things that we believe. What we typically want, even though we'll say we want that, is we want people that are going to kind of confirm or say the things that we want to hear. Say kind of the things that we're comfortable with. Say what already confirms what I already believe. And so I think that, let me put it this way, being a like solid, sound, rational thinker isn't going to make you very popular. But the point, and I hope you get this, that doesn't matter. We shouldn't care about popularity. What we should ultimately care about is we should care about the truth. And if we actually think well, if we apply ourselves to thinking well, to thinking consistently, to thinking principally, we will arrive at truth, and we will be better able to navigate a very difficult world of ideas. And as Christians, we'll be better able to reason with the world around us and bring them to that all-important truth.